This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content.
The title of the thread was Pussified Nation. And it was just this screed of bile that at the time we dismissed as this over-the-top character, this cartoonish idea of masculinity. In hindsight, looking back on it and having seen what Mark became, we just all realized, like, he's been William Wallace all along. He's marketing himself differently. Pastor Mark is a different persona that's the same ideas, just expressed in a more palatable way for mass consumption.
Hi, I'm Nate.
I'm Gail.
And this is Full Mutuality. So today on the podcast, we are blessed to have...
What?
I don't know why that came out, why I said that. Especially since this is
well,
not...
see you later.
We were like,
sorry, is
before
this
we hit
secret
record,
church?
we were talking about weird evangelical culture things, and like, here we go.
And here we go.
Here we are.
I'm saying blessed. I feel like I'm back at Hillsong now. Be blessed every service. Okay, so we're grateful to have with us Zach Malm. Zach is the co-host of the Veterans of Culture Wars podcast, and is also a musician. And one of the things that I like about your podcast is that in your intro, you always started off with a phrase. I'll let you say it because I don't remember it very clearly, and I want to make sure that it's said properly. But there is something that you say about yourself at the start of every episode.
Well, it's sort of evolved. At the beginning, when we started doing it, I would say, I try to distinguish myself from Dave. He says he's a film buff. I'm a film buff as well. And maybe I know more about films than him, honestly. Dave, if you're listening, I'm sorry. But I'm an amateur musician. I've released my own music, and I played a bunch in church, and I led worship at church. So I'd say I'm a musician, a former worship leader. At first I said I helped destroy a megachurch, and I'm not really sure what I believe anymore. And then the podcast kind of became more and more about specifically my Mars Hill stuff. And so now I just assume that everybody knows what that is. And I say I helped destroy Mars Hill Church, and I'm not really sure what I believe anymore. And I've started adding on to that in the last few episodes, and I'm all right with that.
Yeah.
That's neat. Yeah.
I think that's... So as far as a topic for our conversation here, I think that's going to be it. We're going to talk about Mars Hill Church because, like,
we want to take notes on how to destroy mega churches, and we feel like you might be our guy to give us some notes. Nate maybe wants to take down Hillsong. I don't know.
We've already been attacking Hillsong. So a little bit about my backstory for your sake, Zach. I grew up in the independent fundamentalist Baptist environment, ended up going to Bob Jones University for my undergrad. But after that, I entered the megachurch world. When I came out of that, I took one step in, I guess, a deconstruction direction away from the fundamentalist world. Ended up at a megachurch called Liquid Church, which
I love the names for evangelical churches. Liquid Church.
Speaking of funny names,
I've heard of that.
Yeah, you probably have heard of them. They've marketed themselves pretty well in recent years, to the point where Abraham Piper, the son of John Piper, on his TikTok today, you'll have to go find it. He did a thing about renaming churches through the thesaurus, and he came across Liquid Church and renamed it Moist Church. Or Secretion Church.
Oh, gosh. I don't know that any of these are good, Nate.
No. So Liquid Church was sort of in the Andy Stanley vein of mega churches. And then I ended up getting a full-time job as a children's minister at a church called Emergence, which, and that church started on day one with like 1,100 people, and it exploded from there and caught the attention of the Acts 29 network when Mark Driscoll was still in charge. And we started hosting Acts 29 boot camps. The church continued to grow. By the time I was asked to resign, it was probably averaging around 3,500 or so.
Did they ask you to, I'm trying to remember from your story, did they ask you to read the book Doctrines, or did you do that on your own, or yes? Okay.
No, I almost, it was actually, this is the unfortunate thing about my story, is that I did purchase it so that by the time I was mandated to read the book, I already had a copy ready to go.
I never read any of Mark's books.
Wow.
Well, good for you.
It's always nice when I see them at like the Goodwill or something.
Yes.
I'm like, somebody else got
I
rid
would
of one.
never
That's
give
nice.
that garbage away to Goodwill. I would just
I know,
burn it
like,
in a
like
bonfire.
trash would be better, but
Yeah.
It's always nice
Yeah.
to see somebody
man.
didn't feel it was important enough to stick around.
Yeah, rip out the pages, smoke weed, and I don't know.
I don't know if you read Crispin Mayfield's book Attached to God, but he talks about as a teenager starting a Christian band while living in China called Sanctified Viscosity. And I think they would have been the house band at Liquid Church.
Probably.
That got us into topics of which liquids are okay and which are not okay in evangelicalism, specifically as a teenage boy writing songs about your struggles.
Come, Lord Jesus, come. How about that? Oh, man.
All right. So,
Well, you
Zach,
had you had a Mars Hill adjacent church that you were part of, Nate.
Yeah.
That was, Acts 29, and they copied it, and they loved all the Acts 29 stuff. I didn't have any of that, but he was just so popular. I mean, I think we're all probably the same era. I'm born in 81. I think you're probably around my age, Zach, but I could be 82. He was just the thing. He was popular at the time when we were all, you're 84, Nate. Mark Driscoll was big at the time when we were in our 20s, and he was the up and coming. I mean, I would listen to his stuff online. And so when we got this podcast going, the Christianity Today podcast on the rise and fall of Mars Hill came on, and we were listening to it. We were riveted by it, but we were also annoyed by it because we were like, this is such an evangelical take on what went wrong. And they're kind of dancing around a lot of, because they can't out themselves and criticize things they still do. Christianity Today would still be defending. So we were getting agitated as we kept listening, and we had a lot of critiques, and we had been talking about starting this podcast. So we're like, what topic do we want to jump on for our first episode? And that's what we picked. And
I listened to a couple of those.
You know what?
Of yours.
Yours, I got a hold of your podcast because when I was researching, I was trying to get a bigger sense of the whole topic, listening to obviously the Christianity Today. I was trying to pick out voices that were critiquing. And I think you had Jessica Johnson on yours, on one of your episodes.
Yeah,
and
she'd been on previously because she interviewed me for the book that she wrote about that, and so I'd known her already, and when we started the podcast, she was one of the people I wanted to bring on. So when we first had her on, I think we called that episode the Mars Hill episode, but then she came back for one of our string of episodes covering that.
Yeah, well, we kicked it off with that topic, and I had listened to a bunch of your episodes dealing with Mars Hill because you did a few of them on it, and you had such an important role, I think, in the whole situation. And I just want to say I really enjoy your podcast. I've listened to other episodes that you've done on other topics related to evangelical culture. It's, I know you guys talk about a lot of evangelical things, and you have two very different perspectives because David, is it Dave or David, your co-host? I want to make sure. Dave, yeah. He says he's still evangelical and you're not. And so it's interesting. I get a lot out of listening to the two of you guys go back and forth. And I generally don't. I try and avoid listening to white guy podcasts because that's all I got within evangelicalism. That is literally, that's all I listen to is white men. But I realized I've been thinking this over, and the importance that white guys like you play in this whole community, and just how important it is, because I know that as a woman, and when you are not a white guy, especially as a woman, I was just reading something recently that was talking about how men respond to have a resistance to women speaking. And I don't just mean in the evangelical world, just in general, when women state their thoughts, that there was a thread going around on Twitter, and my female friends were sharing it, and it was resonating with so many of us, just the fact that even with spouses, didn't matter where, brothers, whoever, just that there's often a pushback when women talk that men don't deal with. And talking with other women I knew, admitting that when they got out of evangelicalism and started listening to podcasts on deconstruction, they gravitated towards white men. And I think that white guys still have a lot of privilege. You guys still have a lot of, I think there are people who wouldn't listen to me who absolutely need to hear it from a white guy to feel confident in what's being said. It might even be an unconscious thing, but I really appreciate the work that you and Dave are doing on it. I appreciate the fact that you guys bring in so many voices that are not the privileged people. Like you had the episode you did with Shannon, Dave bringing in, his college friend. That one was fascinating. I know you had Chrissy on, and you guys have taken a lot of time to, I guess I didn't expect that from a podcast with someone who's still evangelical, to give credit to Dave, of bringing in those voices that most evangelicals would absolutely not touch on, and not with the compassion and the education and the desire to change things that I see in what you guys are doing. So I don't know, I just encourage everyone to go check out your podcast. I'm totally making a plug, Veterans of Culture, where I've very much enjoyed it. There's so much good content on it. The last one that I was really riveted by on your show was you talking about your alma mater, Seattle Pacific University. And
so glad you say that.
Oh man, that was fast. So just quick side note, and I can go off on tangents, and I want to get back to Mars Hill, but I'm a pessimistic person at heart. And when it comes to the evangelical world, that was where I grew up. And I look at it and I have a burn it all down vibe, because I see so much toxicity. I see so much pain. In fact, even in my current situation with the evangelicals, I know I see the damage done to my trans family members, to my gay family, and from the evangelicals all the time. Like they are the worst. They are the worst at loving. They are the worst at supporting. They always say the most cruel things, and they're not trying to do it on purpose. It's part of the teaching and the indoctrination. So I really value the work that you guys are doing. And when I listened to that episode on SBU, I was like, I guess blown away a bit at another perspective. I don't believe in changing things from within. I left. I tried and I left. And I think a lot of people have taken that route for legitimate reasons.
That's a very valid route to take. That's how I feel about most of these things.
Yeah.
But specifically with the SPU story, it's become a bigger story since people have seen the viral video going around of the students at graduation handing the pride flags to the president of the university as he hands them their diploma. Yeah, it was really cool. And I'm glad it's becoming a more known story, because that episode didn't do the sort of numbers that I was hoping it would. And I don't make money off the podcast, so it doesn't matter for me, but we
hear you.
To me, it's the most important episode we've done since the Mars Hill things. And I just wanted to be helping push that snowball as much as I could. And there's nothing else, to my knowledge, out there like that. A almost 2-hour discussion, really going deep into everything that led up to these massive student protests. And from we had a student and a professor who is queer, but the right kind of queer. He is married to a woman and thus allowed to be employed there, but very aware of how lucky he was in just finding a spouse that happened to fit within what the school would allow. And so getting their perspective on where things are at, as I've had many discussions with friends that are professors there over the last couple of years, as there's been an increased push internally to get this stuff changed. And so the thing that they hit on that really made me re-examine this idea of whether change from the inside is possible and worth sticking around for is they kept saying, the professors I would talk to before even doing this podcast, they kept saying the change that we're trying to have happen, that this language and the policies is about reflecting what the school already is. This is supported by the vast majority of students and staff. This is only kept in place by a board of less than 20 people. This is not a massive corrupt institution that requires huge changes from within. The changes have been happening over the last 20 years since I was a student and saw fellow students vote down dancing. being permissible.
It is wild.
We now have hundreds of queer students protesting this with faculty. It's incredible. It's inspiring.
I was so inspired because, you talking about, I heard that you telling that story of when you went back, when you were in that Christian university and how conservative it was. And to know that the majority of students and faculty are supportive of queer people, very supportive, to the point where they're doing these protests and it was just, I guess I couldn't imagine this in an evangelical institution. I wasn't imagining this sort of thing happening and taking place. I don't know that it's happening in a lot of places, but I think maybe the Seattle culture, I don't know what's in the water over there or what's happening. I even wonder I have a curiosity with how Mars Hill plays into evangelical culture out in Seattle, meaning that you guys have had some serious, badly damaged, people who have seen the BS right locally, from people taking it in dangerous ways, being a hub of that whole scenario, and then having to be very critical about evangelical culture within the evangelicals in Seattle. I wonder how much that has played into your alma mater being, located in Seattle, and the direction that they've gone throughout the years, that gradual shift, because it doesn't happen everywhere. And to see, anyway, I'd encourage people to go check out that episode because it was very inspiring, and it was your alma mater, and it gave me hope. It gave me hope that change can happen from the inside. And I generally don't believe that. But that story was one of those really, Nate and I do a lot of long distance driving because we're dating long distance. I live in Montreal in Canada. He lives in New York City. He lives in New Jersey near New York City. So we do 5.5 hour drives every week. One of us is driving. So we're always here, check out this podcast episode. And we're giving each other suggestions. And that one was the one I listened to on my last drive. I'm like, Nate, you got to check this out. This was really good.
One of the things we didn't cover on that I do think has an effect on the change inside the culture of the university is that there was a school shooting there, 7-ish years ago, something like that.
I did not know that. That's kind of significant.
Yeah. And, a lot of the professors that are there now were there then, and it really threw everybody there. And I haven't really talked with them about if they see a connection between that and waking up to some extent to the ways that the school had been backwards and unnecessarily unaffirming and things like that. But I have to think that there's something to that in making the folks with the power to change sort of reassess their values and how to best care for students.
Well, thank you for covering that story. And yeah, like I'm saying to everyone else, Seattle Pacific University, fascinating story. Go check out Veterans of Culture War, SPU episode. Very great. But I want to get back to Mars Hill because, like I said, I started following you because you took down a megachurch. And for people who don't know your story, maybe, okay, before we get to that, to how you took it down or what your role was in that, I know, it was probably a group effort. I'm sure you're not claiming to be the one who took down Mars Hill, but I know you played a very significant role with what you were doing online. But before we get there, maybe give us a bit about, did you grow up evangelical? Were your parents at Mars Hill? Did you drift there on your own? How did that all come about? How did you land at Mars Hill?
So I was raised evangelical, Vineyard and Foursquare churches. The pastor of our vineyard had come up from Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, I believe. That there was a connection to the original church that kicked off the whole Jesus People movement in the 70s.
Wow.
And I think my parents were part of the core group that helped found that up in the Seattle area, and went to Christian school run by a Baptist church for kindergarten through 9th grade. My parents went to SPU. They both got music degrees there and taught in public schools for a bit as music teachers. And I only recently thought about that, parents being public school teachers is not a common part of the backstory of people that I have on my show that were raised evangelical, as public schools are such a scary thing to so many evangelical parents that usually that's a marker of you had a different sort of childhood than me if your parents were public school teachers. But that didn't last too long because they soon started a business of providing music and arts materials for worship pastors and churches and stuff. So if you ever acted in the Christmas play,
you guys. I heard you guys talking about Salty on one of your episodes. Did you guys do GT and the Halo Express? That's what I'm curious about, because that's the one
I'm familiar with GT and the Halo Express.
You were familiar with GT?
We did not perform that, but yeah, no, I grew up like in my spare time listening to the demo cassettes we had of kids musicals for churches, and I worked there off and on growing up. Like if I wanted to make some money, I could stamp envelopes or collate, or I started doing like accounting, accounts receivable. And then like I got like an actual job at my parents' business doing like shipping and stuff in college. It was an easy way to do stuff between classes and stuff. And so I'd like load up my schedule for 3 days a week and work there 2 days. And were you passionate about all of this? Like, was your faith something to you when you were younger that you really felt sincere about, that was meaningful to you? Yeah, I mean, I felt sincere about it, but it wasn't until Mars Hill that I felt like it connected with me in the specific church experience. I was not a raise your hands guy. I was not into the hyper emotional type of stuff with the charismatic churches. I didn't want to speak in tongues. And so like
was Mars Hill
never
charismatic at all? Did they do any of that? No. Okay.
No.
All right.
They
didn't
weren't
think so, but
I don't think they were fully cessationist, but they were not like there were elders that spoke in tongues there. But it was not something that they pushed on people or did publicly or anything like that.
I just assume if they're in with the Gospel Coalition, they're probably not too charismatic. It's just a different camp.
But, I mean, Mark's theology is pretty slippery as he markets himself to different people. Yeah,
he definitely is a good marketer. Yeah, totally.
I mean, we can get into that. That's
a part of it.
But
so how did the switchover happen?
Yeah, so a few things, and I like to also point out that like this is how like involved I was. Like I went with my dad one year to the Christian Booksellers Association's annual conference because it was in Anaheim that year, and so we could go to Disneyland in the evenings. Ooh. But I met Carmen, I met DC Talk.
That was my band growing up. DC Talk was the one I was obsessed with.
Sure. My parents' business put on a big conference every year, and like Stephen Curtis Chapman performed there before he was big. And it's, you mentioned Salty. I was more of a Colby guy, Colby the computer. But like I met like the heads of publishing companies who like came out from Nashville to this event and stuff. And like my dad knew them all by name, and, we'd walk the floors of the convention and say hi to everybody. And I got to know these people. And so this is like when I was 14, when I was 15, I got cancer, and it was a very lethal form. And, very, early internet times. This is 97. The doctors told my parents, do not look this up.
Wow.
Don't try to learn anything about this. It was a single tumor on my foot. It's usually on hands. And if it's on your hand, you're losing a hand. They took out like a third of my foot, replaced it with flesh from my back. Told me if it ever came back with like a single cell, I'd lose my leg below the knee. And that surgery was what would have been my second day of high school in a public school. So I had 10 years of Christian school, 1 day of public school, then massive surgery, missed a month. And, I was getting letters wishing me to do better, get well from like the heads of these publishing companies that I'd met the previous year and stuff. Like, they were nice folks. And, but I think from that, I developed a real serious outlook on life and the future and goals and the sort of stuff that kind of set me up for somebody like Mark to come in. He in a lot of ways his non-theological parts of his message, which was a lot of that, was a proto Jordan Peterson sort of pull your pants up, man. Yeah. there's a lot of ex-Mars Hill folks that still liked Mark that became fans of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, not a big surprise. Yeah,
having seen Mars Hill collapse in 2014, I saw the rise of Trump as another iteration of what I saw with Mark, and the Jordan Peterson stuff was very reminiscent of Mark. I see Mark all over now.
Yeah. You got some up close experience with what that kind of guy look like, what a narcissistic white guy with craving power looks like.
Yeah. And I wanted to note, because when you were saying earlier about like the overabundance of white men in this space, when Dave approached me about doing this podcast, I reached out to Stephanie Drury, who we've had on the podcast a couple times. Her social media stuff is under Stuff Christian Culture Likes, which sounds like a very surfacey, jokey thing, but is really about taking down the patriarchy and such. And I was like, Stephanie, what do you think? Does the world need another white guys talking podcast at all? And she's like, well, what it doesn't need is an untherapized talking white guys podcast.
Yeah.
And I had done some therapy at that point, and I was like, okay, well, I guess that means I'm in the clear. and it wasn't entirely, we've learned things as we've done it, as simple as, I created a meme the other day with that, like, the exploding brain thing where it's like starting an evangelical podcast, realizing your podcast is about white evangelicalism, because that's the vast majority of evangelicalism in this country. Mm-hmm. Realizing that your podcast is about white Christian nationalism. Realizing your podcast is about how purity culture, white Christian nationalism, and toxic masculinity like intersect and feed each other to support the patriarchy. Like, having these conversations and doing these stuff, I've kind of realized, it's reconfirmed my findings that there is inherent toxicity in evangelical theology and the experience of being raised evangelical. And I ultimately think that on the whole, evangelicalism is bad for the world.
I mean, we're right there with you. I feel like nobody starts there. And a lot of the people who leave are the ones who are so passionately involved. I know you were involved at church. We were all, Nate and I were both on pastoral staff at some point. So we were really, and I was a woman on pastoral staff, which is a marker in patriarchal churches to even,
I think Blake Chastain says we're the youth group graduates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. And so like, you go through that, and then you want to change things from the inside, and you're trying to figure it out. And eventually you just realize like this whole thing it's too far gone, and it's really bad. Like it's actually harming people. Yeah. And, you going back to your story. I can get us to that point. So essentially, not long after starting high school and all that, I finally sort of found my people, because I was in a large pool. And so I was like, oh man, like the punk kids, that's who I'm connecting with. That's who I relate to. And so friends were introducing me to music and stuff that I never would have heard at the Christian school. And so I started going to all ages shows all the time. Mars Hill was running an all ages club called The Paradox that was, to my mind, the last truly altruistic thing they did for the city of Seattle, because there was a ridiculous law in the books making it extremely expensive for anybody to have all ages shows. This massive insurance requirement, and this weird super cop friendly policy of any all ages show has to have an off-duty cop there, but the cops don't have to show up if they say they will. And then they can show up and say, you don't have a cop here, we're shutting you down. But churches were exempt. And so Mars Hill, one of the elders, not Mark, one of the three founding preachers, like bought this old like 1920s movie theater, like single screen in the University District. And they turned it into an all ages music venue, not for Christian bands to play at.
and then on Sundays they did church there. And so I was going there for a year before I had any knowledge of a church being involved with it.
So they weren't really using it just to push the church, because it took you a whole year to even figure that part out.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I mean, bands that played there, talking to the bookers and stuff behind the scenes, they would figure it out. But it was not, there was no bait and switch. There was no, well, we've all had a good time here tonight, but while you're here, before you go, let's talk about my guy, JC. Mm-hmm. None of that. And like there was a recording studio upstairs, and like bands that are not Christians were like recording records there and stuff. Like it was a really neat space, and a space that otherwise was not available to the under 21 music fans in the city for a period of time. And so I really appreciated that. And when I started going to SPU, there's this period of, the students will go and like try out the local churches. I was from the area, but being on the other side of Lake Washington, the east side as we call it, going into Seattle was something you do on the weekends and evenings. And, I wasn't about to be like attending a church not in my neighborhood. So right. When I started going to SPU, started checking out the other churches, and all somebody had to say was, hey, the Paradox is run by a church. The drummer from Roadside Monument plays worship there. We're going to go. You want to go with us? Yes. And I was hooked right away. And I don't recall if Mark was even preaching that. I was 18.
Okay.
It was 2000. And
before he blew up.
Oh yeah. There was only a couple hundred people there at the time. 300, something like that.
How long?
And
it
eventually became like, what's that?
How long do you think Mars Hill had been going when you showed up on the scene? Like
3.5 years, something. I mean, like from its like very initial like core group in a house sort of thing.
Okay.
They'd gone through a couple locations.
So take us to, what year was this when you showed up at Mars Hill?
This was 2000.
Okay.
Fall of 2000. And so I pretty quickly got plugged in there. I started volunteering at the Paradox. Started going to the weekly home group of one of the main bands there. Like a lot of my social circle and overlapped with that, or was based around that. And it felt exciting that, Mark specifically was trying to pull in young creative men who would be eventual high income earners to tithe large amounts, but he was using their artistry and cultural cachet to form a community that was interesting and a magnet for young arty people. The tagline of the church at the time was meaning, beauty, truth, community. And I was like, yes, 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 yes. And his sermons were like over an hour long. I was used to like 25-minute, like really basic, like just reminding us that Jesus loves you sort of sermons. And then, the Jesus boyfriend music stuff. And this is like, folks in punk bands that I like, I say punk, not like generic 3-chord skate punk or whatever, but, DIY culture. Folks, writing their own, all the music they played there, they wrote, except for a few old hymns that they did new
iterations of
arrangements of. But otherwise they were writing all their own stuff. It was good. Actually, my very first encounter with them was my dad got their first CD sent to him at the shop, and he gave it to me and was like, "This is weird. You might like it."
He knew your taste.
Yeah. And so that was probably like 99, actually. So I think I probably that when I heard people were going to there and they said Mars Hill, I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, that CD."
So you show up in 2000. The church collapses in 2015. Where is your exit point? And where do things start? 2009 is your exit point. Where do things start to turn from this place is a place I love to like you left in 2009, but where did the start of that for you become uncomfortable and I don't know, your eyes started to open up?
The start for me as somebody that is not really interested in mass experiences, like I'd so much rather see a tiny band in a basement with 25 other people than go to an arena and watch them from a mile away on a screen. And so when Mars Hill got their big building, their warehouse building in Ballard in summer of 2002, I somehow was able to buy a house up the street from there, because he very quickly got into my head, like being a man.
That's what you do as a man, right? Like if you want to be a dude, buy a house.
I convinced my parents to refinance their house and loan me the down payment for this. You know, it was, before the big financial collapse, so they'd hand out a loan to anybody. And so I got a space. I got a house up the street from where the Mars Hill big building was going to open up a few months later. Marketed online as like walking distance to Mars Hill, looking for like Mars Hill people to live with us. Wow. No sex allowed.
That was really in the advertisement. Wow.
It may not have been in the advertisement, but it was in the contract that my roommates had to sign. Which
so
I think.
Wait, so you bought the house and then you put up some rooms for rent?
Yeah,
and that's okay.
Yeah, it was a 5-bedroom house, so the mortgage got paid by me having all the rooms filled with friends.
So you wrote up that contract about the no sex?
No, one of my parents' friends through work had done some property management before, and so she just like for free like helped put this together for me.
Okay.
But I remember when I put up the ad at before the big building opened up in their other Ballard location, Mark walked by and saw me putting that up. He says, you know what that is? A wife magnet.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course you would say that.
That sounds very Mark Driscoll.
Yeah. It didn't work out quite that way, but a bunch of my roommates got married, and I was like, come on. I'm the
You're
one
like,
with the house.
this formula is not working how I thought it would work.
Yeah.
I'm the owner of this place.
So, yeah, once it started like getting big like that, I was like, it's not really my thing, but I still think that what's happening here is like a movement of God or whatever, and it's exciting, and we're trailblazing and growing, and if it's growing, it has to be good, right?
And that's sort of what kept a lot of people with their eyes closed, right? Like that line of seeing the growth as some sort of a proof that God is at work is probably one of those things that kept a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, a big
blinded?
thing for me, along with the Ballard building opening up, they closed the Paradox, and that was a real bummer to see. I mean, the laws had changed, making it less of a required gift to the community, like other people could have all ages venues. So I got it. It never was making money, but it was an outreach to young folks in Seattle that actually made sense. So I valued my friends there. I valued my community. I cared more about going to the weekly home groups than the Sunday services. I mean, there was a time when I was going to the Sunday service twice. I'd go to watch Mark preach in the morning and then go see a different location because my favorite band would be playing at that one. Like Mark didn't always preach. Eventually he kind of pushed out the other two founding pastors and he became the only one preaching, especially once technology allowed for them to do that. At first it was like physically driving a DVD of the sermon after he'd preached the first one, but yeah, so I was like, okay, like Mark says like crazy stuff now and then, but that's just weird Uncle Mark, and I just sort of excuse it because I didn't care as much about his preaching as I did the community itself. 2007.
Do you think your community had that same vibe as you? Did they feel like Mark just says weird, crazy things and we just dismiss it because that's just Mark? Like you were finding some stuff a little odd and like weird Uncle Markish, but like was that a common thought among other people if you chat about what Mark said, or not really?
a lot of us would say weird Uncle Mark, like like a lot of us had that phrase that we'd use. So it wasn't uncommon, but it became a real sticking point for me. So in 2007, there was an incident where he fired a couple folks that were not on board with his plan to consolidate all the power with himself.
Was that Jeff Petrie and Brent Meyer?
Paul Petrie and Bent Meyer. I ran into Bent the other day getting a contacts prescription. He gave me his business card, and he was like, "Have you read Jesus and John Wayne?" I was like, "I have interviewed her. Maybe we should talk." Because he doesn't want to talk about his Mars Hill stuff, but his involvement there was pretty important. So yeah, the two of them got fired. They shouldn't have. I was hearing stories. Mark was slashing guys' salaries 40% if they were telling him he should stop being such a jerk in meetings. He really was laying down behind the scenes this law of
he was showing
I get
people
to do
he's
whatever
the authority.
I want. Yeah. It was bad. And I wasn't hearing about all the ways that it was bad at the time, but it was bad. And 2007, that incident is when the congregation was starting to get a sense that the behind the scenes things were not good. And
is that where he did his famous, the bus is going to run over people and you either get on the bus or you get run over by it, right? Was it after that?
Yeah, he preached that immediately after firing them. I think Paul has talked about not it happened so quickly that he didn't even understand that he'd been fired when he heard Mark talk about that, and he was like, "Boy,
didn't realize
whoever
he was
he's referring to,
that
feel
poor
bad
guy.
for them."
Oops, that was me.
I think I recall him saying that, but yeah, they did this whole thing. There was such an uproar that they did this. They opened up a forum thread on their internal social media site that they developed. That one guy developed, and they sold to Zondervan and kept most of the profit.
Oh, was that the city?
Yeah.
Yeah, my old church used that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was another guy named Zach that developed that. I forget his last name now, but yeah, there was a guy that created it. They threw him a bone. They gave him a check, but they considered it their property when they sold it. And so they opened up a thread on there and said, ask your elders anything, for the next 48 hours or something, write whatever you want. We will go through all of these. We will put together responses to all of them. And we will be open and honest. And I just wrote, hey, I've been going here a long time. This community matters to me. Increasingly, Mark keeps saying things that he has to apologize for. He keeps stepping out of line or whatever. And I find now that I kind of cringe whenever somebody asks me what church I go to, and I'm getting tired of having to defend Mark all the time. I'm fine defending Jesus, but I'm having to defend Mark. So I just want to know, is he saying these things on purpose that hoping that the controversy will drive traffic? Is it a marketing strategy, or is he really just screwing up?
Okay.
It's a slip of the tongue.
What do you think it is now, looking back?
Oh, I know what it is now.
It's marketing.
He put out a blog post where he gave it a term. For one thing, in their response, they did not answer that question. But he answered it when he blogged and said that he does this thing called riot evangelism, where he likes to just go and throw bombs, and then everybody has to wade through the carnage. And, he has, staff and all these people at church that help triage or whatever. I forget all the other uses of the word, and so I'm like, oh, okay. So he's not I was asking, is Mark stepping on landmines, and do we need to help him get better at that? I'm like, nope, he's not stepping on landmines. He's throwing bombs.
He's throwing them.
Wow.
And so, but their response in the large document that came back, and I've since talked with the elder that actually wrote the response to me on this, and that was a very good conversation. But the response, and I was the only one that got this, they just said, hey, if you're having trouble defending your pastor, you should probably find a different church. And they're the ones I signed a contract. You're the guys talking about this as as a marriage, you know.
Membership,
the covenant membership stuff.
Mm-hmm. That was a big Mars Hill thing, right? Like it was like you were married to the church. This is your permanent commitment.
Had to take classes, had to have interviews, do all this stuff.
So who told you that you need to find a new church? It was the guy. It was in the document that they wrote back as a response.
Yeah, it was like the former executive elder there.
So that sounded like, when you heard that, like it's very conflicting with everything you sort of thought about what that meant to be part of Mars Hill. Like that must have been a very strange thing to read after you had signed covenant and taken classes.
It really threw me for a loop. So I stayed there for 2 more years because they opened up a small campus that was closer to where I lived, and that ended up basically being all my old friends from the Paradox started going there. They like even brought the old candelabras that they'd used there. The campus pastor was somebody we knew from there. So it was like doing the Paradox all over again. And my favorite band from the Mars Hill years, from like the big church and before that, like they had broken up, and one of the members of that band and his wife and another friend of ours started a band for this new location. And we did that for about a year. And then in 2009, while we were recording, the married couple had got the word that their toddler had leukemia, and it was like the last day of recording. We had like scratch vocals, but we didn't have like the real vocals, and band's done. Like we are like obviously need to focus on the health stuff. So band was over, and at the same time, a friend from that location was launching an Acts 29 church. And I believe it was the only Acts 29 church in the Seattle city limits, essentially because like Mars Hill had like non-compete issues. But like the guy launching it had like lived in Mark's basement. They were buddies, so he probably got some special deal to be able to do that. I don't know. But so basically within 2 months of that event occurring, the whole band moved to this Acts 29 church.
Did you go with them?
Yeah. We all sort of like individually made the decision to leave. I remember like standing in church. It would have been a few weeks after Easter. The last time we played together was the Easter service, and watching somebody else play, and just I probably had a panic attack, but I just remember I just like audibly said, like, I just like looked around and said, I got to get out of here. And that was like the last thing I said to anybody in that church. And yeah.
Sorry. I'm curious a little bit, like if we could pause here for a couple minutes. Because all of the other churches that I'd been to, even the Acts 29 church that I was a part of, the bands were the church band, and you would sort of rotate, drummers and rotate, guitarists and bassists and singers.
It was glorified karaoke.
Right. And even at Hillsong, when I was there after Emergence, it was the same sort of thing. That the band, as talented as these musicians were, always sort of, melted into the brand of the church. It seemed like from the outside looking in that Mars Hill was a little different than that, in that the each band sort of stayed together. Some of them even had names.
Yeah, they all had names.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. My favorite was this band Team Strike Force. And
that's
that
a great name.
That had Jeff from 90 Pound Wuss and Raft of Dead Monkeys and Suffering and the Hideous Thieves, various like tooth and nail related stuff.
Yeah.
And Matt from Roadside Monument, and his wife played keys. It was like real people that did real bands that toured outside of church. And it wasn't people that like grew up writing worship songs. It was guys that knew how to write good songs and the church could use some music. So they're like, I don't know, let's try out writing worship songs. So like that band, like I went to their home group, and basically our home group went like a month ahead of whatever Mark was preaching on, and then they'd write songs that would be ready by the time he landed on that point or whatever. And they weren't like constantly writing new songs, but we were writing all our own stuff, and there was great musicians there. And towards the end, when like Mark was consolidating his power and really making sure that the like women cannot do man things became pervasive through everything. Like he shut down a band that Matt's wife Rose was doing, and they were incredible musicians. Like the drummer in that band, now he's in the National. He's played with Sufjan Stevens. He played on the last few Taylor Swift albums. Like he's a really legit musician.
Was the problem was his wife was too forward in the band? She was doing too much?
In that band, Rose was the leader of the band.
Oh, you can have women leaders.
Team Strike Force, she wasn't. She played piano and sang backing vocals in Team Strike Force, but then she left and started this other band, Sons of Thunder, and they got shut down because she was a woman leading the band.
So wild. Like I'm always fascinated to see, because patriarchy it just goes throughout evangelicalism, but I'm always curious to see like what the lines are, and it always changes from church to church. Like some it's just like they can't be the senior pastor, some it's they can't teach either, some it's, and like that's another level, like you can't even sing in the band, and sometimes that's even a murky one. Like in my old church, they didn't have that rule per se, but then like some families who were very conservative were very bothered if they felt like a woman was too up front, and it was like, it's so weird. Like that stuff, looking back now, it's just, it's gross. It's sad. It's sad as women to see how much that fight to keep women out of using their gifts and talents and skills was so normalized and became such a part of the culture. And yeah, at Mars Hill, I feel like that's a huge piece of Mars Hill culture, was the way women were so horribly.
There was a woman in my band there, and she got in trouble for like gesticulating in a way that made people uncomfortable or something, or like just kind of moving to the music in a way people didn't like.
Wow. It's funny, just sticking on that topic for a little bit, how when I was at Hillsong, one of the things that drew me there was the fact that women were up front. They had women preaching. The pastors were always the husband and wife were given the title of pastors. Of course, behind the scenes, who's really in charge. But one of the things that I, finding out after leaving Hillsong, one of the rules that apparently was in place, I have yet to verify it with people who would be in the know. And I have some connections. I just haven't really tapped them yet. But one of the rules that I heard about, and I heard some of the fallout from, was that if the male worship leader on a particular Sunday was playing guitar, the female worship leader could not have a guitar as well. So the woman had to be holding the mic while the man was the one playing the guitar, and then eventually that started
more
morphing.
Manly if he's playing the guitar instead.
That started morphing into they were trying to minimize the number of women who led worship with a guitar. I think there were only 2 or 3 in the rotation in Hillsong, New York City, who were able to play guitar. And of course, when Brooke Fraser came around, she could, because she's Brooke Fraser. You can't take the guitar away from Brooke Fraser.
I don't know who she is. Did they have a requirement that somebody play acoustic guitar and somebody play electric guitar?
It wasn't a stated requirement, but they often would roster.
Terrible combination.
They often would roster. But here's the other thing too: is that whoever was mixing was highly controlling of the blend, right? So even if you had an acoustic guitar up on stage, if it was, let's say if it was a United song or if it was a Young and Free song, it was very rare that you would even hear the acoustic.
Turn down that volume. You're on stage singing, but we don't hear you.
Yeah.
Wait,
and then the same thing with
the vocals got to be way up always.
Oh, well, yeah. And then
Brooke, sorry, I'm going to go back to something. Is Brooke Fraser the one that did Oceans? Was that Brooke Fraser?
No, that was Taya Smith.
Oh, okay.
Brooke was the one who wrote Hosanna.
Oh, okay.
Which then like every other church did for like 20 years after that. I'm sure they're still doing it on Palm Sundays. But then
Acoustics and mixing.
So one little anecdote. There was one worship leader who didn't play guitar, but he kept getting rostered with women who could play guitar. But they wanted to, from what I understood, they were trying to enforce that rule. So they started teaching him guitar so that he could play while he was singing. Yeah.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah.
All
so
right.
then they could take the guitar away from the woman. Anyway,
of course, patriarchy
I just thought that was
in church.
fascinating.
Yeah. So you guys had that going down in some ugly ways at Mars Hill. You had some of that patriarchy getting into the musician stuff, taking away it from your friends who you respected. So I guess one of the questions I had at this part in your story is your friend group, your home group, the church that you had started attending that was the former Paradox people. Were you guys, I mean, before you left and to go to this new Acts 29 church, were you all on the same page of like, Mars Hill's getting really weird, we need to get out of here? Like, was it a group thing where all of you were sort of like, were you alone in your like, this place is, you had your panic attack? Did other people, were you having those conversations with the people around you that something was off, or it wasn't sinking in at that point?
Yes and no. If we'd been able to really have those conversations, we wouldn't have ended up at a Acts 29 church, probably.
Got it.
I mean, everybody was calling that Baby Mars Hill. The fact that it was like all, so the small Mars Hill location was ex-Paradox people, and then the Acts 29 church was also ended up being a lot of ex-Paradox people.
Right.
Like it was all people that had left Mars Hill, and a lot of it was just the emphasis on Mark, how big it's all become, like renting out the stadium where the Seahawks played to do Easter and stuff like that.
I remember that.
Just people are just not down with being part of that. And so it was a while before the conversation shifted into like, I'm thinking Reformed theology is not cool. And then friends started leaving the Acts 29 church.
How long did you end up staying there yourself at that?
I was there for 5 years.
Okay.
And so that's where I was leading worship. I was
was that
doing all these...
your base camp for taking down Mars Hill? Were you in that church while you were doing those?
I was in that church while doing it. Yeah. When I told the pastor that we're about to launch this website and that I'm mentioning him in the essay that I'm putting up with my name on it, he was like, maybe take me out of there. But yeah. I mean, basically, there was an escalating series of public issues at Mars Hill with Mark's plagiarism, with the misuse of tithing.
When did the plagiarism?
Money.
When did that? I know that one was a huge one. In fact, I regret never talking about that on our first episode that we did, because I feel like, anyone who was still trying to
2013, 2014.
I feel like they collapsed not too long after that.
The collapse was 2014.
The collapse was 2014.
Yeah.
Or 2015, yeah. 2014 into 2015. Because I remember it was around the same time that I left my Acts 29 church. All of that news was really, building.
It was 2014.
I left.
It finally collapsed.
Yeah, I left Emergence in 2014.
I mean, if you look it up, it says it collapsed on January 1st, but I feel like it started to fall apart in the fall.
That's just a legal thing.
The legal thing. It closed its doors in probably August or something, right?
Yeah, like Mark quit August or early September. Okay. We published. I just made myself like a reminder to like tweet the anniversary of posting this. It's like July 29th, I think, is when I posted the William Wallace document.
Had you started your website dealing with Mars Hill?
Yeah, okay. So we ran this website for about 6 months. So basically, you're like, okay, we have come to the position that it would be best if people left Mars Hill, and it is not a healthy thing and not good for people. I was still generally on board with the theology, hadn't really started deconstructing, but it was enough to say that it's an abusive, toxic culture. Were
people coming to you with their stories, like individual stories that were really starting to filter in to you, like to make you inspired to do this?
I had lots of talks with people, and there was various Facebook groups where people were talking about some of this stuff, but ultimately the website came about from a realization that people weren't going to leave Mars Hill if they didn't trust any of the stories they were reading about what's going on at Mars Hill.
Stories from the outside they were suspicious of.
Exactly. All like the local alternative weeklies and stuff had always written pieces that were negative about Mark and Mars Hill. And Mark had cultivated a sense of distrust of outsiders, where, he wrote that book, Doctrine. So clearly he knows what is right and what is wrong. And
he's the guru for doctrine, everyone.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a book.
And he'd tell us these anecdotes all the time about, I had a meeting with local pastors, and these crazies are talking about this and that and this. And
Did
it was
Mark
all
claim that he read one book a day? Didn't he have stories
yeah, and at first I believed that, which is just a crazy thing to have believed. But it just felt like as soon as you step outside these walls, it's dangerous and a slippery slope to blasphemy or whatever, apostasy.
I mean, that makes sense.
And so you got to stay here.
Why you would have?
It was scary.
When you left, it would have made sense that, before you even started to deconstruct, you would have needed to go into a place that was somewhat under the umbrella of.
Oh, yeah.
If you were so afraid, if he'd done so much indoctrinating into other churches and what they're like and how bad they are.
Going to that X29 church was like, okay, we'll have the correct theology. This is a safe place to go to for my soul. But we'll see. And so basically, we knew that people weren't reading the stuff that was being published about Mars Hill. We knew that Rachel Held Evans could criticize them till the cows come home, and they wouldn't pay any mind to that. And so some friends started talking, and we were like, let's put a website together where we tell our stories of how we feel that God brought us to Mars Hill and that God brought us out of Mars Hill, and put our names on it. And, all of Mark's talk about, we got anonymous bloggers writing this and that. And we're like, no, here's who we are. And we've been there long enough that if you're reading this, you probably know who we are or have a friend that knows who we are. Or
that's kind of a big deal.
Knows us.
In a survivor community, to stick your name on something is kind of especially with such a bully who had so much weight like Mark Driscoll, choosing to do that, to put your name.
And that was the deal that we had to make with everybody that sent stuff in. You got to be willing to put your name on this. And, we'd vet the stories as well as we could, reach out to a mutual friend and be like, yeah, it is, is what they're telling us, what went down with them. Yes. Okay. We'll put it out. And it became very quickly a trusted site for people on the inside to share amongst themselves, and they were willing to read it. And the whole goal was to have people recognize their stories in other people's. So, in some ways it's a precursor to these podcast conversations where we just have people on and they tell their stories, and people listening that maybe at the beginning of deconstructing or in a toxic church environment or whatever, maybe recognize their stories there. Now, Dave's goal in the podcast is not to have people leave their faith. And I'm not going to say that that's necessarily my goal, just as, Blake, I already mentioned him once, but Blake Chastain, coining the term ex-evangelicals, that's not a final landing identification. That's a term that you're free to apply to yourself as long as it makes sense for you,
Right.
And so telling stories, recognizing our own stories in them, and having that in turn help us understand ourselves and continue on our journey is a powerful thing. And I learned that from doing that. Sorry, I'm just going to say that doing that site, and we called it We Love Mars Hill.
What was the title of the website?
It was called We Love Mars Hill. At first, we were going to say We Are Mars Hill because it was this like, we are old timers that like built this community. Mars Hill is not just Mark. And we were talking with a friend that had an advertising agency, and like, what do you think about this name? And he suggested changing R to Love. And we had people that were like questioning our motives, like, you call yourselves We Love Mars Hill. You clearly hate Mars Hill, or you wouldn't be doing this. And like, we built this community with you guys that are probably reading this. Like, we've been there a long time. It matters to us. We have relationships with people there. We love Mars Hill. We recognize that Mars Hill is more than Mark Driscoll. And we don't think Mark should be the pastor. I don't think he should have ever been a pastor. Right. And so, yeah, we're not joking when we say we love Mars Hill. And so I think people got that, and it meant something to them. And going through the submissions and dealing with that was heavy. And, ultimately I finally ended up going to therapy after that and changing to a Nazarene church for a few years.
So that website was a key part of your own movement and your own growth and your own deconstruction and your own like, it was a way of processing deeper what happened at Mars Hill as you're listening to people's stories. And
I've gone back and read the story I wrote on there, and I wouldn't stand by it anymore. Like, I have a different perspective on things. But it was powerful, and it was really neat to do. And so out of that, so people were reading that, people were sharing it, people were leaving, people were submitting stories to us. There was clearly like movement happening. And then we started talking about, okay, remember back in 2000, so when a month after I'd started going there, remember that those forum posts where Mark used this other identity? He was basically just trying to sound like Tyler Durden from Fight Club. And he like said all that insane crap in character.
How did you know it was Mark Driscoll? This was the William Wallace character, right?
Yeah. He admitted it in a book, in his first book, The Reformation Rev.
Yeah.
He's like, I thought it'd be fun to do this little character, and I got a little out of hand, but he didn't like say specifically what he did. Like, the title of the thread was Pussified Nation. And it was just this screed of bile that at the time we dismissed as this over-the-top character, this cartoonish idea of masculinity. Fight Club was a big deal at that church, and I don't think they ever understood Fight Club, but they're like, yeah, Tyler Durden's a man's man. This movie's great. And so that's what he was doing. But in hindsight, looking back on it and having seen what Mark became, we just all realized, like, he's been William Wallace all along. He's marketing himself differently. Pastor Mark is a different persona that's the same ideas, just expressed in a more palatable way for mass consumption.
The Chapel Probation Podcast takes a critical look at evangelical colleges and universities, focusing initially on Azusa Pacific University, where I taught English for 15 years. I'm Scott Okamoto, and I'm writing a book about how I deconstructed from faith completely while at APU. This podcast, though, is my tribute to the students and other faculty who survived evangelical higher education. They faced ridiculous racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ hatred, and all manner of bigotry. From the heartless evils of the prosperity gospel to the destructive pseudo-theology of purity culture, the stories will break your heart, but they will also inspire. These people faced bigotry and fought back. In a weird, kind of sick way, we went through some shit, but we formed identities and we formed communities through it all. I hope you will join us.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a quick break from the conversation to let you know that we have a fantastic new way for you to support the podcast. If you like what you hear from our show and want to partner with us, head over to patreon.com/fullmutuality to donate. As a partner, you'll get exclusive content, access to occasional live recording events, and more for as little as $5 a month. Thank you already for your support of what we're creating, and now, back to the conversation.
And so it just dawned on you to think back to that period of time and what some really weird stuff you remember him writing back in the day on this forum?
Well, we'd never forgotten it, but it became obvious that now is the time for it to be seen by other people. We'd known that the church had been, I know the specific person who was tasked with like hunting down all the physical copies of it that existed. Because, this is the year 2000 when this forum post happened. People were printing out all their email in 2000, So this was like an 11-page forum thread that people had printed out hard copies of. Oh. And somebody at Mars Hill, a pastor, was like finding out who had them and destroying them. Other people.
Everything online had been deleted, or was there a way of tracing
it was in the Wayback Machine.
Oh,
that's where we got it. So me and two other guys that had been involved with Wheel of Mars Hill, one of them had the idea of going through the Wayback Machine. I think once we got a CDR with some like screenshots of the post that somebody had made back in the day, it gave a little direction of where to go in the Wayback Machine. Although, like we all knew, like the old site, what the address was and all that stuff. But yeah, so a friend of mine just went through the archives of the formerly public forum. This was before the city, and just went in the month or two after the date it would have happened, because remember, it was in December that he actually posted this, and found instances in the Wayback Machine of 10 of the 11 pages being cached. And we never got the 10th page, but my other friend packaged it into a PDF and created a traceable link for it. And they didn't really want their names out there. I'd already had my name out on the site and all that, and was willing to publicly put it out there. So I was the one that dispersed it into like the Facebook groups where there was like thousands of people talking about the stuff going on in Mars Hill and stuff. And from there, I guess Matthew Paul Turner saw it and Rachel Held Evans saw it. But, we put it out there first. And within hours, we saw, tens of thousands of hits, just like it was climbing like crazy. Do you remember some of the lines off the top of your head of like what was some in this content that was just so shocking for people on the outside to hear?
Content warning.
Yeah. Let me pull it up here in my Google Drive. I mean, the file is still out there. I'll read a little bit of this. I've never read this out loud, but one of the things in that Christianity Today Mars Hill podcast that bothered me so much is that
I so wanted to ask you about this, Zach. Sorry to cut you. I really wanted to know your take on that podcast because you were so deep in it. You had such a part to play. Did anyone reach out to you from the podcast to talk to you?
Yeah, Mike Cosper reached out to me, not about having me on the show, but to confirm some of the details of what I was involved with in the lead up. And actually, like early on when they heard they were doing it, like I reached out, I messaged him. I didn't know who he was. I messaged him, was like, hey, just, I released the William Wallace stuff, and thank you for covering this story or whatever. And I hope that you will interview such and such a person. I don't think that this story will be told correctly if these voices aren't included.
And were they included?
One of them I got lunch with, and he didn't realize that Mike had reached out to him, and afterwards went through his email and found it and ended up on the show, and is like the guy that has like one of the better quotes on the whole thing, saying that Mars Hill was rape culture, and that they were facilitating marital rape, and that's what that was. And so I was glad that voice was included. But over and over and over, you have people being interviewed on there and are talking about Mark's supposed gifts as a communicator. Right. Oh, he's such a gifted communicator. Yeah. And I'm like, well, like to communicate, like you it's encoding and decoding. You know, you're trying to communicate an idea that you have in a way that somebody on the other end is going to hear it best they can. And like specific ideas and Mark was, his gift was, I called it, his gift was in long form extemporaneous bullshit. He was like a salesman. You could give him a topic and he could talk for an hour. He had this story that he'd tell us all the time that he thought was like, what a great story about, oh yeah, in high school one time, I went on a debate team event because I was argumentative. I wasn't on the debate team, but they invited me to go on this, and I won the whole thing and got like a collared scholarship. And the whole all that I did was attack the other person, but it was effective, and I won. Isn't that great?
Wow, he was telling on himself, like telling you a bit of his psyche and what goes on in his head. Yeah,
you know, and I had friends that like when their bands played at services with him, and they'd like have like a brief conversation in the green room before he went on stage about what he was going to be preaching on. You know, they'd say something about the verse, and he'd be like, "Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way." And then he'd go out and do like 45 minutes on what they had just said. You know, like, and he wasn't like researching and he wasn't slaving over these sermons. He was winging it. At the beginning, he probably was putting more time into it, but for a long time, he was essentially just going out there and bullshitting for an hour.
Yeah.
So what got you? How is that communication? How is that a great communicator?
Yeah. Was that the piece of Mars Hill that got you riled up the most of the podcast about the rise and fall of Mars Hill, that Christianity Today? Was that the piece ticking you off? Like that was getting you annoyed when you were starting to go there?
There was a bunch of things. I mean, ultimately, I think by the end of the podcast, he landed in a place that would have been a great starting point.
I don't even know if I finished it. I think I got 8 or 9 episodes in, and I thought they were done.
I think a lot of people dropped out because, like,
bonus episodes.
I dropped off around 7.
Yeah,
or 8.
See, they mentioned me by name in the final episode, and I only had a couple old friends that don't know what I'm up to these days reach out and be like, "Is that you on there?" I'm like, "Yeah, that was me." I'm like, "Good for you. It's good to like get the wolves out of the church and you know, protect God's people or whatever." I'm like, "Yeah, okay." But yeah, I think a lot of people dropped off by then. So yeah,
I was almost worried that his last episodes were just him trying to cover his butt with the criticisms that everybody, like, I feel like, you know, like you're saying that you're done the podcast and you're throwing in a bonus episode because this podcast series is making you a lot of money. And I'm like, people are starting to pick apart what's wrong with it. I mean, we get hits all the time on our first episode because that's what we were doing. And people want to, there's some people who realize something's amiss. But I've been curious to see if the last 2 episodes or the recent ones that he released were, you know, trying to cover, you know, after the fact, trying to correct, you know, when you hear the criticisms and then you use that in order to reshape a narrative.
No, I mean, the final episode, like one of the last quotes that he gets in there is from this guy, Nate Burke. Nate's a friend. He was Mark's assistant for many years. Like he would like travel with him and all this stuff. And I remember like before it fully collapsed, our kids went to the same preschool, and I remember talking to him and him saying Marcel wouldn't be in this position right now if Mark weren't an asshole. Like that's what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. And at on the podcast, the CT one and the last one, like he says straight up, like Mark doesn't give a shit about anybody. And that's not a shepherd. Like he shouldn't be doing this. He shouldn't have been doing this. He doesn't care about other people. He's not capable of caring about other people. And that didn't seem like the sort of thing that would have possibly been in the first half of that season of episodes. But also, you know, he wasn't talking to people he should have been talking to. He wasn't centering the victims. They were never going to interrogate the toxicity of the underlying theology there. Like even when he's like if you're you know a Christian in 2005 or whatever, you'll of course know about John Piper's seashells. sermon from some conference. I'm like, why the fuck would I care about that? No.
Maybe talk about John Piper telling women that if their husband smacks them, they should stay for a night and then seek help from the church after they're allowing their spouse to abuse them, because the church teaches that it's like they should just endure it for a season.
I'm not down with John Piper at all, but they were never going to go there. And, you know, my friend Stephanie Drury, you know, he said that he wouldn't have her on because he found her to be vulgar.
Isn't that interesting from a podcast that has people swearing right in the opening? Like bleeped out?
Somebody
but like
swearing on the opening who put his wife in the hospital.
Yeah.
like
yeah, well, I guess if
the
you're
documents are online. So
if you're an abusive man being vulgar, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's sad.
Yeah, but you can't handle a woman using vulgar language.
Yeah, so I had many problems with that podcast. Ultimately, I guess I'm glad it exists because it tells enough of the story that I think people can tell it's not the whole thing, and they seek out parallel stories about that and find more things, and that can help give them a more well-rounded understanding. And if they stick to the end, there's some good stuff towards the end. But yeah, so what they said at the end was that me releasing the William Wallace document was the straw that broke the camel's back. That ultimately is what caused the collapse at the end. Like that's what made them force Mark to step down, and he was going to go through a restoration period or whatever. You know, that's
he
all
would not
bullshit,
have
like,
that.
they knew about that the whole time. They'd been sending people to track it down, and they fully intended to restore him anyways. Right. So that was going to be for show. But I'll read a little bit here. So he posted a bunch throughout this, but so this is December 5th, 2000, 8:52 a.m. William Wallace II. We live in a completely pussified nation. We could get every man, real man, as opposed to pussified James Dobson, knockoff crying, promise-keeping, homoerotic, worship-loving mama's boy, sensitive, emasculated, neutered, exact male replica, evangellyfish, and have a conference in a phone booth. It all began with Adam, the first of the pussified nation, who kept his mouth shut and watched everything fall headlong down the slippery slide of hell/feminism when he shut his mouth and listened to his wife, who thought Satan was a good theologian, when he should have led her and exercised his delegated authority as king of the planet. As a result, he was cursed for listening to his wife, and every man since has been pussified. Sit quietly by and watch a nation of men be raised by bitter, penis-envying, burned, feministed single mothers who make sure that Johnny grows up to be a very nice woman who sits down to pee. Few more paragraphs here, and he ends it by saying, "Oh God. I know many of the women will disagree, and they, like Eve, should not speak on this matter. And many men will also disagree, which is further proof of the pussified
they've been
epidemic.
Pussified, of course.
Having now become airborne and universal, pussified men are inarguably legion. Nothing short of an exorcism is needed." And, you know...
Trinity Church, this is your pastor.
Yeah, a lot of you listening to this.
I know, right? All the people from Trinity Church who are listening to our podcast.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, it's another, like, Christianity Today was never going to venture. It was like, how did this man of God get led astray by his pride and arrogance and ruin a good thing God was doing? And I'm just like, he never should have been a pastor.
Oh.
The guy is not qualified. The guy doesn't care about people. He just doesn't. And
it's interesting, thinking through this story and then watching in real time currently the collapse of yet another megachurch and seeing these people doing the same things. I mean, stuff that Brian Houston has been posting to Twitter recently, which I think he might have blocked me recently.
Well, wait, before you get onto that, I'm going to put a pin in it, Nate, because this is important. This is very important. So Nate prides himself on who blocks him on Twitter. And he actually worked. Yeah, you're laughing. You know exactly where I'm going. He really tried hard to get blocked by a certain person. Go ahead, Nate. Make your announcement. Well, how did you do it?
Yeah, Driscoll blocked me.
He worked at that.
I just kept...
Which Driscoll blocked you? Because I didn't block you. I have at Mark Driscoll.
Oh, you have at Mark Driscoll. No. At Pastor Mark blocked me.
Yeah. No, a friend of mine was like volunteering at the church, and he set Mark up with like half a dozen different possible accounts, and he picked Pastor Mark, and my friend kept at Mark Driscoll and handed it off to me several years ago. I've hardly done anything with it.
You should give it to Stephanie.
Give it to Stephanie.
Yeah.
I post a few things, but yeah.
I'm sure she'll know what to do with it since fake Driscoll is no longer a thing.
I looked into giving it to her, and she's like, I think they'll shut that down immediately, probably.
Yeah, because we still don't know why fake Driscoll got shut down, right?
Not really, but
I gotta ask her.
He complained enough or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were. Do you remember, Nate, what you did to get blocked? Because you were trying. You wanted that as a badge of honor to get blocked by Mark Driscoll.
Yeah, I wanted Driscoll to block me. And I followed him around too.
I muted him before he blocked me. Like I added the words Mark Driscoll so I wouldn't see them.
Yeah, which is fair. You should.
Yeah, you were not.
I being an East Coaster and only my only connection to him was having been on staff at a Acts 29 church. So I have enough distance from this guy. Well, the other thing too is I also wanted people to see that he can't, he just posts stuff, and sure, he's going to block whoever is trying to call him out, but I tweeted enough at him and replied to enough of his stupid bullshit that that he eventually blocked me. And I think a few people started liking some of my tweets, which I think got his attention, because if it were just me hounding him, I'm sure he wouldn't have cared, or his handlers wouldn't have cared. But if other people were starting to get, quote unquote influenced, I'm sure that would pose problems.
I'm wondering if he blocked me after his Obama tweet.
Oh, what was that tweet?
I don't remember that.
Okay, I'm
not super active on Twitter, so
yeah. No, well, this is when Obama was getting sworn in for his second term. On the day of that, Driscoll tweeted, "Praying for our president, who today will place his hands on a Bible he does not believe, to take an oath to a God he likely does not know." And I remember I responded, "I cannot believe I spent 9 years at your church." And that's when I unfollowed him. And he may have blocked me at that point. But
nice. You know what?
I've been waiting to talk to somebody who was inside at Mars Hill when this was going down, because I'm sure they knew about the site. They knew who I was. And I want to hear the stories of I want to know if he was yelling curses that involved my name or anything.
I am proud of your going out. If that is what got you blocked, that's a great way to get blocked. That's quite a tweet. Sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack, Nate. I just, all along in this conversation, I was going to have to add in at some point that I know you worked hard at getting blocked. Just when you mentioned Brian Houston's tweet. So going back to that, I don't know where we were at.
Yeah, I was
the similarities.
I was talking about some of the similarities. I think So when it comes to these people, and I think increasingly now we're starting to see the beginnings of Hillsong and how it was founded, and how Brian Houston is another one who should never have been a pastor. And these guys like to talk about how growth is a marker of God's favor. In the Pentecostal
say if you're not growing,
side, right?
You're dying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there was a part of me and that's probably what attracted me to these larger churches, and my progression outside of fundamentalism was to gravitate towards these larger churches. I think partially because I had been at a church that was no more than 90 people at a time.
Well, also your church attitudes in fundamentalism was that separatism was important. And so keeping small was important.
So what I,
being the other way,
what I was thinking when I entered these spaces was that, this many people can't be wrong, because I was in that space where there were only 90 people there. So of course that was probably mess, and it kept shrinking. But
I had a particular guy that was like, he's my canary in the coal mine. If he's still there, it can't all be bad.
Right. Yeah. And we have those people too. Right. Which it's another thing that
point. like for people to maybe think through they might be a canary in someone else's coal mine.
Yeah,
like,
because he's come out since and be like, yeah, I fucked up. Like, I shouldn't have been there. I was helping perpetuate some really bad stuff.
Yeah. And that's a thought that I had, and there are people who I know who are still at Hillsong who have this mentality that, well, I'm there to X, Y, and Z. I'm there to protect my team from the toxicity that's happening right above me, or I'm there to, try to promote change. I'm close enough in proximity to the leadership there, and maybe I can start enacting some change. And there are people around you who are looking to you for guidance. And they're assuming that because you're there, it's a safe place. But it's not. So the best thing you can do for those people that you're trying to protect is to leave. I feel like we've said that often on this show, but in all of these churches, like I'm all for #empty the pews, because the evangelical spaces are incredibly toxic and damaging and harmful. And not just the churches, but the theologies, the belief systems, they are rife with pain, suffering, oppression, rape culture, as you were mentioning, Zach. They just perpetuate these things. I don't know where else I want to go with that, but maybe
my issue, I see Hillsong and Mars Hill as very distinct things from my perspective. I have always hated Hillsong because of its empire-like control of culture. Its spread of this homogeneity of evangelical expression. The fact that 50% of the songs people sing in churches are Hillsong songs. I've never understood why a pastor can be a celebrity, why a worship band could tour. I just think that should be a local calling to care for your actual neighbors and your direct community, and that they have such they're so hell bent on massive success in a very they're a business, not a church. As the Hillsong documentary put over and over. And, they're trying to make church McDonald's. Yeah. The value of McDonald's is they've always, they're a real estate company, not a restaurant. But when you walk in McDonald's at any country in the world, you know what's on the menu and you know what it's going to taste like. Yeah. And that's what Hillsong was pumping out. And Mars Hill was so distinct in its cultural expressions, where it was unlike any church I'd ever been to. And I visited a lot of church. Every time my family went on vacation, we went to church.
Yeah, I think some of that might be the Pentecostal theology. What is it? The 7 pillars, Gail?
Seven mountains.
7 mountains. Yeah, sorry. And so I think some of it stems from this idea that they are supposed to do this work to
take over and
take over. Yeah. All of these aspects of culture in order to usher in the coming of Christ. And that's how they seem to want to do it, because they turn to those kinds of people. Those kind that sort of marketing. But I don't want to turn this into a conversation about Hillsong.
But
though I do think a conversation about evangelical. So. Yeah. I do think a conversation about evangelicalism at large, and to recognize that, Zach, as you were saying, they do in many cases kind of occupy a sort of polar opposites on evangelical spectrum in their approach, in their praxis, I suppose, and in some of their theologies. If you stay within evangelicalism, their theologies are different from each other.
Yeah.
But the similarities between them are too numerous, I think, to say like these are completely different. I think we can learn lessons from each church that then applies to the evangelical world at large, and trickles down from the massive church that was Mars Hill down to the little 200-member Acts 29 Reformed Presbyterian church. And then the same thing with Hillsong, all the way down to your local Pentecostal Hillsong Network church that only has about 300 people.
So when I left the Acts 29 church, I was like, I am going to find an uncool local church. Nothing that's a destination sort of thing. Nothing that's an event. I'm just going to go to a local church that is in my community. And it was a Nazarene church. I waited about a year before I started playing music there. And when I started playing music, it was like all Hillsong, and it was all these songs I'd never heard before because I didn't listen to Christian radio. I knew "Shout to the Lord" in the '90s, and that's the stuff from working at my parents' business. But I stopped listening to CCM when I was like 14, and so like having I heard Oceans for the first time when I had to play it, And like, you don't know Oceans, you're like, how could you not know this? But then I started looking into this stuff, and it's just so thoroughly invaded all of these churches that you see more guitars are sold for worship than any other use. And there are particular guitar pedals that is this is how you get the sound for Oceans or whatever. This is what's on the pedal board of this guitarist from Hillsong. And so specific gear is very popular because it's the accepted sound you need to have to play worship guitar. And I was lucky enough to, when I played worship there, I became friends with the worship pastor. He was learning guitar as he was doing, he was hired on as somebody whose background was in choir directing. And when I joined, I was like, so we do write songs? And he's like, nah, we're not going to do that. But okay, can I write my parts then? Yeah, you can do that. So I put more time into it than anybody else on the team, probably because I'd listened to it for the first time. I didn't know any of these songs. And most of the people in the congregation just wanted a karaoke band. They wanted to hear the songs they knew on the radio. And I was like, I can only do this if I'm playing something that I enjoy playing. So I wrote my own parts for just about every song we did. And luckily I had the freedom to do that, but it was just bizarre to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It is an odd phenomenon. When you think about how much, Hillsong has pervaded the evangelical world. So I'm curious about so you landed in a Nazarene church after leaving the Acts 29 sort of hip reformed spaces. From there, you ended up leaving evangelicalism altogether. Sounds like perhaps you've left Christianity to a degree. I could be misreading that. But what then?
Probably, yeah. I don't really. Maybe God exists. Maybe God doesn't exist. I don't really believe in an afterlife. So
yeah.
Sounds like I've left it.
Did Trump factor into? I want to get into this. I really do.
Oh, sure.
Where did that line up with your story? Where were you when he got elected, and how did that play into things?
I was frustrated, but like it was for many people, Trump illuminated how little the people that taught me right from wrong and absolute truth and things like that, how little they actually stood by their convictions and how much they were principles of convenience, not conviction. That what they believed just wasn't challenged until he came along, and then they rolled over and all right, I'll believe something else then if that's what it takes to support this guy. And, I've never seen an episode of The Apprentice. I've just known him to be a clown for my entire life, an obvious con man. So but it never ceases to amaze me, how much evangelicals are just begging to be conned. They want that in their lives. And I saw that with Mark, and I saw that with Trump, and I saw so much of the narcissistic personality disorder sort of stuff that I'd been reading up because of experiencing it with Mark. All that made sense when people started talking about that with Trump. So
was it a shock to you to watch the evangelicals you knew around you getting sucked in after, like, people? Did you see people who, you know, realized Mark was problematic and all of a sudden they're gravitating towards Trump now? And
oh yeah. There was a guy at Mars Hill that, like, he started one of the bigger Facebook groups, but his whole problem was just like Mark needed to roll back the 2007 bylaws to make the structure of the church more ecclesiastically proper or whatever. And he was like a big Trump guy. He was so stoked when Kellyanne Conway got on board. He's like, I've met her at the prayer breakfast. She's amazing. And he was just one of those people that was absolutely adamant that the Access Hollywood tape was not an admission of any sort of action. But, you know, one of those people who's like, oh,
grabbing
yeah,
women
boy.
by the pussy. That
yeah,
one?
he's like, oh, yeah, really terrible that he'd say that. I'm just sick to death. I really wish he wouldn't say that. But, you know, he's apologized. And, you know, rough language is not something that we should condone. I'm like, it's not the language. Like, it's like, I can, like, there was a lot of swearing at Mars Hill. Like, you know, I could say, man, you're like the fucking greatest guy ever. I really like you. Goddamn, what a guy. I am communicating something positive using words that offend some people. Mm-hmm. I could say, well, if you want to know my idea of a good time, it's surprising women by putting my hand into their vaginas without them expecting it. Didn't use any bad words there. I am admitting that I enjoy habitual sexual assault. That's the problem. And he just responded with, well, I wouldn't vote for you. Like, just king of missing the point here. Yeah. But that's what it was, over and over and over, choosing to miss the point because accepting the reality of what Trump admitted to would make them have to care about their supposed convictions. And, you know, the embrace of power was too important. So, that opened up my eyes further as far as I was already skeptical of celebrity in Christianity and pastors with followings, cool churches in any way, really. But the Trump stuff was like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, realizing they weren't holding their noses at all. They were psyched to vote for this guy. It
is, to me, mind-blowing because it wasn't a minority of white evangelicals. Like, it wasn't a 50-50.
Here's like an amazing story. So my wife's uncle was a state representative. We got along. We saw each other regularly. He like lives in the same town as her parents and her uncle and stuff. So we'd go out there regularly and they'd all get together. Had a lot of conversations with, you know, he's one of those Republicans that would like say they like the Colbert Report.
But they didn't realize it was satire.
Maybe they didn't fully get it, but like he seemed like, okay, you know,
they
whatever.
were agreeing with his satire version character.
Yeah, so like we can have decent conversations. We never got mad at each other. So right after Trump got the nomination and he picked Mike Pence as his running mate, I was at a wedding for this gentleman's son, and he had told me stories in the past of having met Newt Gingrich and being like starstruck back in like the 90s or whatever, like being able to like drive the guy around town when he was visiting. And Gingrich had been talked about being a potential vice president pick. And so it just as a way of striking up conversation, I was like, I saw that your guy Newt didn't get the VP nomination. How do you feel about that? And he's like, well, I'm not really in the habit of supporting serial adulterers. And so, collecting myself, I kind of was like, all right, how do I ask the obvious next question here? It is this man's son's wedding. Okay. So I said, so can I assume that you don't support the top of the ticket then? And he like realized he'd stepped in it and kind of sheepishly looked down and looked at me and said, Yeah, actually the county chair of the Trump for President committee.
Of course.
And that just crystallized like, hypocrisy is not news, but having it be so blatant. And in the family and with somebody with power, he ended up taking a job in the Trump administration. Well, kind of like in the Department of Agriculture or something. But you got a federal job, you got a pay bump, and I was like, you got to be kidding me! This is ridiculous.
Those convictions just flew out the window. I think that's, if I'm going to tie like Hillsong and Mars Hill together, you got a charismatic church on one side, you've got, the West Coast vibe with their alternative, homegrown stuff, their own culture, not charismatic, reformed. And, yes, there's some strings of patriarchy. It looks different at Hillsong. It's maybe a little more covered, whereas Mark was a little more blatant. There's a lot of commonalities, but the white evangelicals are all on board with Trump. They all really bought into it's quite something on how, for people who want to separate out evangelicalism from the political side. I know you're an anomaly, Zach. We were talking earlier about this, that you didn't buy into all the Republican politics stuff, but it does seem to be a very common denominator among white evangelicalism. It seems to go together. They know, the Republican Party knows this is the bloc that they can count on for support, and they need them. They need white evangelicalism. They need to have a Mike Pence, the second person on the ticket, and Trump needs to pull out his Bible at the right moments. And then when he says the other stuff, they'll just go, he's a baby Christian. That's why he said the wrong thing, because we need to support him and pray for him. And then we can just erase everything else that he says and does. That's, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They always had ways of excusing things and proclaiming him as one of them. And for a while I was like, I don't want to be a Christian. If that guy's not a Christian, I can't be part of that. And now I'm just like, he's a Christian. Yeah. And I'm not going to be part of that. It takes so little to actually be on the team. And I see no reason to, Chrissy Stroop over and over reminds us defaulting, treating Christian as default good is dangerous. And there are bad people who are Christians. And,
Nate and I still attend church. We go to a progressive church. I don't even like using the word progressive because I find that community is one that I have a hard time with on so many levels. But I think
so. You're the woke joke folk. Cool.
You're the woke.
We
joke.
Are the woke.
We
joke
are the woke joke folk. Hashtag woke joke folk. Us. Yes, we should throw that in with us. But I definitely I don't think I would feel safe in any Christian community that could not acknowledge straight up that Christianity as a whole has done a lot of harm. I grew up being told we were the good guys and that Christianity as a whole did so many good things for society. But reading actual history and seeing over and over again where Christianity has dominated and harmed people, I don't want to be part of any Christian community that cannot continuously speak out against the abuses and call out the problems. And I listened to that episode you had with Chrissy, and it's a fantastic one. And I think it's an important one about addressing that specific stuff. Yes, we're not the good guys. We're not the good guys. And and I'm not trying to tell anyone to stay in church. I think that's an important piece. I actually think for most people, it's probably healthy to not.
I might go to church if I didn't have kids.
Yeah.
But I don't trust what they're going to do to my kids.
Exactly.
What they're going to say to them, how they're going to teach them to distrust and hate themselves. I feel like I've done enough work that I could get some enjoyment out of some of the rituals without believing any of it if I were to go into a religious space. There's a Romanian Orthodox church up the street from me, and I was taking a walk the other day and tested the doors to see if they're locked, and they were. But if they're open, I probably would have gone in, and that would have been the first time I've been inside a church in 3.5 years. And maybe I would have just sat down and just taken it in and contemplated some things. I don't know what I would have done. Maybe I would have started crying. But what I'm not going to do is bring my kids to an evangelical church that's going to shove purity culture into them, that's going to teach them that they can't trust their intuition or their heart, that they are incapable of being good outside of this God-derived sense of morality, that they are, kindling essentially, unless they say the right words. And I'm not going to put that trauma on them. And I wish that I hadn't when they were younger, but I think they were young enough that it didn't stick.
Mine were older when I deconstructed, like they were already almost young adults. They were in their later teens, and I brought them to VBS. I was the youth pastor. I really, really, I put them in everything. I did the other version of Awana, everything. I put them in everything to try and indoctrinate.
We looked into doing Awana. My kids did VBS.
Yeah, I did all of that, and you know what? It didn't stick. Even though something went wrong, and I'm very thankful. I think I'm really thankful to see my kids didn't absorb those like they see the problems with it and are able to be critical about it. And I'm so thankful they didn't go through my journey. And I'm thankful to hear your kids also, it didn't stick, in that they're, the stuff that we got indoctrinated into really young, the harmful pieces that we've had to go to therapy to undo or to try and work our way through. I'm happy to, I don't know. It's a good note to finish off and to think about how we get to raise our kids differently, and the idea of a next generation growing up without those kind of toxic ideas as a part of their, I read something today that was like, it's so confusing that we're worried that kids aren't old enough to know their sexuality or gender identity, but we think they're old enough to be taught about eternal torment if they don't believe the right theology, and they need to make a commitment to Christianity for life in order to be saved. That's age appropriate. You're 3 years old, 4 years old, but don't try and figure out what gender identity or it's very.
I've loved that I've been able to have conversations about that stuff with my kids, and have the language to even have that my parents didn't have. But now and then Facebook absolutely. Will remind me of a post from when my youngest was 2, and I walked into his room and he's singing Nothing But the Blood of Jesus by himself. And I just thought, oh, how nice, how cool. He's hiding the word in his heart. And I just see that. I'm just so grossed out and creeped out by it. Why does a 2-year-old need to be singing What Can Wash Away My Sin? Nothing But the Blood of Jesus?
We were taught to indoctrinate them. And I this is a theme that I like to repeat. And as I close off, I do want to say this. We are miracles. We are miracles for making it out. We weren't supposed to make it out. We've been taught to brainwash our own kids. We've been taught how to pass on these messages that are harmful, that don't make sense when you look back. But that was part of our upbringing. And so that's what we passed on. And the fact that we were able to break out of it is a miracle, because everything was supposed to prevent us from being able to see those things, from being able to step out of those circles. And I look at the work that you're doing on your podcast. I look at the voices you're bringing in. I look at the topics you're covering. And I think it's such a great service that you're providing for other people. It's such a labor of love. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate it so much. And I'm thankful you were willing to come on today and chat with us and share some of your story.
Yeah, before we go, Zach, you still need to answer the question: how do you bring down a megachurch?
We want to know.
Insinuate yourself into the upper levels of it by being a valued member of the community for 9 years, and then remember all the gross shit that happened and tell people about it. And
God,
have everybody go, "How did you stay there? That's gross shit." Yeah, it was. I'm gonna go to therapy.
Yeah, I was about to say that sounds like a pretty expensive therapist bill.
Yeah, I found one that's in network, so very excited.
It works out. Yeah, I feel lucky in that way too. I did find one that was in network, but my copay is very. It's like pocket change. It's 3 cups of coffee a week, which I'll gladly sacrifice for all of the work that I need to do. The podcast is called Veterans of Culture Wars. You can find them wherever you get your podcasts. Zach, this has been a blast. Thank you again for coming and hanging out with us. Anything else? Where can people find you on the socials, around the internet?
On Twitter, I'm at Muzach, Muzach. and muzak.bandcamp.com. I have a Christmas record that I put out. There's only 100 vinyl copies of that. That was sort of written during the beginning of deconstruction. Like the last song was like after my family canceled Thanksgiving because we argued about Trump too much. So it's nice to listen back on that now and being like, oh wow, I was definitely starting a journey when I recorded this. So yeah, I'm on there. We're just about to launch some merch for the podcast, which is exciting. Cool. I don't expect anybody to buy any of it, but I put in some work designing it all.
Nice. If you've got a link, we could throw it in the show notes.
I put together a link tree finally, which will have that on there, so I can send that to you. Awesome. All right.
And
if you want to read my writings, Pussified Nation, it's No.
Yes. By your alter ego, William Wallace II.
Yeah, absolutely. That was me. That's how you take down a megachurch. You write things under a fake name, get them to put in their book that they wrote them, and then go, aha, you're the bad guy. So, yeah. All right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure. Absolutely. And I got to go get to Zumba now.
That wraps up another episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. And if you don't already have one, head over to our website, fullmutuality.com, for a list of all the apps you can find us on.
We couldn't do this without you, our listeners, so thank you so much for your continued support. Speaking of support, one of the best things you can do for us is to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review.
I'm pretty sure 5-star reviews get you an extra crown in heaven.
But seriously, if you found this episode insightful, spread the word and share it with your friends.
And don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Full Mutuality. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast.